So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Development Studies Association of Ireland's Annual Conference 2021. My name is Neeta Mishra, and I'm the current chair of DSAI. We had hoped to make this an in-person event, but here we are in front of our cameras and laptops. So thank you for joining us here this evening. DSAI facilitates a space for open dialogues, debates, and discussions amongst policymakers, development practitioners, communities, and academia, linking the local with the global, bridging gaps within dominant narratives, discourses, and hoping for transformational development practice. The aim for us is to strive towards a better world, especially in these extraordinary times as we learn to cope with multiple pandemics, including COVID-19, forced migration, wars, starvation, deaths, environmental degradation, and of course, racism. We know we cannot leave it to governments alone to combat any pandemic, especially climate change. We are perhaps now ready to learn from our ancestors, our foremothers, and of course, forefathers. And more importantly, we now value the knowledge of indigenous peoples, Adivasis, and those who value the interdependence of all lives, in all forms. So today we hope to facilitate public discussions to reflect on our own roles in the context of the climate breakdown. Our theme of climates for development aims to open up conversations, both new and old, on what is the meaning of development in an era of pandemics, especially of rapid environmental degradation. Have we been sustaining colonial, extractive, and unjust models of development, or have we managed to establish transformative alternatives? What is the right climate of development? We take hope from community-based climate activism. From our youth and children, our hope lies in degrowth, Cinderella economies, deprofessionalized intellectuals, and of course, donuts. So here I am. I welcome Michelle Winthrop to give opening remarks for the conference. Michelle is Policy Director in the Development Cooperation and Africa Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Ireland. She leads policy engagement in global health and education, governance, gender, and food systems. She also currently represents Ireland on the executive board of International Fund for Agricultural Development. Previously, Michelle was climate lead within DFA and a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiator. Before joining the Irish government, Michelle was programs director for UK NGO Farm Africa based in Addis Ababa. Michelle has worked for many years prior to that as a livelihoods advisor within the UK government in headquarters and on postings in Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Central America. Following Michelle will be Gustavo Esteva's keynote opening speech for the conference with Dr. Orla O'Donovan as discussant. So welcome again, everyone. And over to you now, Michelle, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Neeta. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, I am honoured, of course, to deliver these opening remarks at this conference. I'd like to thank DSAI for the invitation. It is, of course, a pity that we cannot be together, after all, in person. I think if we've learned one thing over the past couple of years, it really is to value the richness of interpersonal interaction. And really, that's one of the most fundamental building blocks of our work and development. I'm also honoured to be introducing both Dr. Orla O'Donovan from UCC and Gustavo Esteva this evening. Both Orla and Gustavo are thought leaders in the field of development theory, and my sincere hope is that they will both challenge us somewhat tonight. It is through challenging each other in healthy debate that we genuinely learn. Recent global political developments have demonstrated the very real danger of groupthink, and the development sector is no exception to these perils. The COVID-19 pandemic has challenged us like never before. There is no doubt that it has set us off course on our pathway to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We're only now beginning to see how far off course we actually are. We have seen an alarming increase in malnutrition. An estimated 13 million more children are predicted to suffer from wasting in the next year, malnutrition's most visible and horrible manifestation. The pandemic has created a global education crisis, with an estimated 20 million girls unlikely to return to school without targeted interventions. Health systems are under strain like never before, with consequences for the treatment of TB, AIDS, and malaria, and the provision of sexual and reproductive health services. The World Bank estimates that this year alone, 150 million people will slip into extreme deprivation for the first time, and all against the backdrop of growing conflict, for example, in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, and a climate crisis whose manifestations are becoming clearer year on year. The first ever climate-induced famine in Madagascar should surely be a clarion call to us all. Within the government, we feel that the prioritisation set out in our international development policy, A Better World, has been somewhat vindicated by COVID-19 and its impacts. Our emphasis on health, education, food, and humanitarian response were just what was needed when the chips were down at the beginning of the pandemic. We were able to build on long-standing relationships and reputation in these sectors and provide effective and timely responses. However, we have felt the need to reassess some core values in the last 18 months and see if they are still relevant. Our policy talks about reaching the furthest behind first as a core principle of all our work. There have been times when we have wondered if that was an unhelpful jargon or whether indeed it could prove operationally useful. We are still working on how the mechanics of a so-called furthest behind first approach will work. But in reality, as we were reorienting programs and reassessing priorities in the spring of last year, that guiding light proved really useful in determining response. Applied consistently, that criterion is important and does reinforce our values as an institution and as a people. A focus on human rights is another of our core values. We began to see an alarming shrinking of civil liberties associated with lockdowns, discrimination of some key groups, such as the elderly, and in some cases a breakdown in the rule of law. That emphasis on rights-based approaches did help us to focus our efforts somewhat and support partners that were defending those rights. And indeed, our engagement on climate is and ought to continue to be very much focused on the rights of people facing the crisis. A belief in the power of civil society is another strong value of ours. We remain alarmed by the shrinkage in the space for CSOs to operate, just at a time when so many of the poorest are reliant on services and support provided by civil society. We as the government were proud to have championed the agreement at the OECD DAC on a recommendation on civil society, might I add, in the face of some significant opposition from other members. From the outset of the pandemic, we felt strongly about the role of multilateralism to address this greatest of challenges. The threats to global cooperation and multilateralism are many and varied, but we believed and continue to believe that we need the UN system now more than ever. Global cooperation delivered us a vaccine in record time. Global cooperation delivered us a mechanism for distribution and additional supports in the form of the ACT Accelerator and COVAX. Are they perfect? No. Have we got it 100% right? No. But in the face of heightened self-interest among the majority of nation states, for somewhat understandable reasons, the sort of global cooperation and solidarity we have seen in response to COVID has been nothing short of remarkable. Now we are at an inflection point in multilateralism, considering how we can cooperate in future pandemic preparedness, just at the point when the UNFCCC process needs to demonstrate its worth in the form of a COP26 resolution. Never before in global peacetime has humanity needed multilateralism to work, and the coming months will be the litmus test of that. The pandemic has also stimulated reflection on how we work too. Many of you are old enough to remember the Paris Principles on Aid Effectiveness and associated processes. You will also remember that Ireland was a major champion of that drive. Some of the air has gone out of those tyres now, or at least the normative process that underpinned aid effectiveness. And perhaps that's not a bad thing either. We have bigger challenges now, new voices, new incentives. Aid has fundamentally changed in nature too. That said, some of those principles of aid effectiveness are still highly relevant today. Coordinating our efforts at country level, focusing on results. The importance of country systems is demonstrated by how some countries' health systems were well able to cope with the pandemic despite resource constraints, and others crumbled. Mutual accountability is still relevant, even more so, and being tested like never before in Glasgow as we speak. But as I mentioned, the world has changed and changed some of our previously held ways of working and assumptions. Fragility and conflict continues to grow all over the world. I know many of you are Ethiopia veterans like myself, and we are all heartbroken to see the evolving situation there. This year's events in Afghanistan have also prompted a lot of self-reflection for many aid agencies. Dreadful jargon aside, we work on the so-called humanitarian development nexus, and that has never been more important, nor has the work on localization. We must pivot in how we operate. We must absorb higher risk appetite and more proactively manage it. But we must remember that as Ireland, we have an inherent understanding of fragility and an empathy born out of that. Our own fragility is an issue. Now more than ever, Irish people understand the vulnerability that we face as a small island on the edge of Europe. The perfect storm of growing climate impacts, Brexit and the pandemic has created an inherent understanding that Irish success is massively reliant on the world around us. And if we want to benefit from those linkages, tourism, trade, education, we need to give back. We need to support efforts in the EU to address fragility in the Sahel if we expect our friends in the EU to support us on Brexit. We need to support efforts at stabilisation in hotspots around the world if we want to keep our citizens abroad safe. And we, as the government, need to tell that story effectively. One thing that has not changed, however, is Ireland's role on the global stage. We fought hard, as many of you know, to secure a seat on the UN Security Council. And as many of you will know, we are working hard in that role, on Ethiopia, on Iran, on women, peace and security, and on climate and security, among other issues. We continue to invest in development cooperation and these debates so that we can continue to have legitimacy in calling out injustice and continue to be listened to. That matters to us, and I believe that matters to Irish people too. I hope this evening will generate a robust debate on a number of issues, and I really do look forward to a great discussion. Dr. Orla, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you. Is Gustavo with us?
He hasn't yet joined, Orla, I'm sorry. I've just emailed him again. Yeah, there he is. Yeah.
Hello, Gustavo. Are you with us, Gustavo?
Hello, Gustavo. I am so happy you're here. So happy to see you. We can't hear you. You are muted.
No, I am in.
Hey,
lovely to see
hello.
you again.
Hola, good to see you.
Hello.
And
Hello, Gustavo. So lovely to see you.
So I just a quick introduction. We have Michelle Winthrop from Irish Aid who just gave a little, speech, and you've already met Dr. Orla O'Donovan, and here you are. I will go off the camera now. Thank you.
Okay, well, everybody, it is an enormous honor and pleasure for me to introduce Gustavo to you. Gustavo Esteva, as you know, is a highly inspirational activist, columnist, public intellectual, public intellectual, deprofessionalized intellectual as well. A highly inspirational and challenging post-development theorist. And I think is somebody who's also very disruptive, I think, in a very positive way, and who very forcefully shows us the limitations of our conventional ways of thinking and of being. Gustavo, I had the great pleasure of meeting with Gustavo in 2014 when we had a Thinkery on the Commons in Dublin. So it is absolutely wonderful to be able to speak with you again, Gustavo. So I just want to so Gustavo is going to speak to us, and the title of his presentation is Beyond Climate and Institutional Collapse, Openings to a New Era. So I look forward to our discussion, well, to hearing you, Gustavo, and to our discussion following it.
Muchas gracias. Many thanks, Orla. It's a real pleasure to be with you again and to start this conversation. Hopefully we will have a conversation and I will not be the only one speaking this afternoon. And yes, I would like to introduce a very important kind of provocation about what I see as a very important change in the scene, in the political scene in the world. No more blah, 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 said Greta Thunberg a week ago at COP26 conference in Glasgow. And she added, no more exploitation of people, nature, and the planet. For her, change will not come from those politicians and people of power pretending to take our features seriously. The leadership for change is to be found among the people themselves at the grassroots. 10 years ago, when she was 8 years old, Greta became sick after observing the silence and inaction about the climate situation that was her main concern. She stopped eating, she stopped talking, and she lost 10 kilos in 1 week. She then was diagnosed with a form of autism and started her amazing campaign. First of all, appealing to the Swedish parliament. She continued for months and years in that vein, generating an impressive mobilization to put pressure on the governments and international institutions. In the process, Greta, like millions of people, learned that the governments know very well how to ignore people's mobilizations in order to continue the path of destruction at the service of capital. Greta was not alone in the rebellion against that situation. A solid group of activists came to Glasgow these days. They did not come to present any demand to the governments or politicians, but to listen to other activists and to weave with them agreements on action. In the name of the organization Indigenous Future, for example, 15 brilliant Indigenous women were very active in Glasgow. They sent a very clear message. Those inside the conference should learn to be silent and to listen to Indigenous women. They should stop the simulation. We don't need development. We know how to live in our territories. Like Greta, Re Cabrera started in primary school her activism about gender and the climate. In September 2019, she was one of the organizers of the Third World Climate Strike. The pandemic limited her mobilization, but she began to participate in other activities. Now that she is 19 years old, she came to Glasgow in the group Fighters for Future Mexico. In one of her interventions there, she observed that there is not much time to react. And instead of looking for the big picture or global action, what is needed is to act at the local level. The climate catastrophe is already with us, she observed, and forcing us to widen our struggle. With other friends, she created IGNIA, an organization in which they combine the ecological struggle with actions against racism and patriarchy. We all are affected by climate change, but those historically oppressed are more affected, she said. She considered that the climate struggle should be combined with social struggle, taking into account all the oppression suffered by the people to look for climate social justice. Mitzi Violeta Cortez, a Mixtec woman, 22 years old, went to Glasgow with a group of indigenous women. We did not come to talk with the powerful, she said, but to articulate ourselves with other struggles, hacking the official speeches. We came to talk about defending our territory, bringing hope and strengthening our own organization. The change, she insisted, will come from below, not from the top, from the so-called leaders of the world. For her, the indigenous people suffer more than any other group the consequences of the climate crisis and are fully involved in resistance. Like other young people, she explains that any struggle about the climate should take into consideration social inequalities. We came to the conference, she said, to sit with others, to have a dialogue and an encounter. We are eager to construct and articulate. In these spaces, we are saying, yes, we can do something. There are other ways. There are people doing it. Georgina Cortez, a Mexican biologist who participated in Surciendo el Planeta, Darning the Planet, which brought to Glasgow 200 trees darned by the collective, described how desperate she was when she entered the group. But she discovered there the immense power and capacity of women to generate needed changes. There are no limits, she affirmed. We never assume that something is not possible. This tenacious optimism is born because in a group, when they are together, they can really nourish hope. The last 10 days in Glasgow represent a magnificent window to observe what is happening in the world. The conference itself offered solid public proofs of the amazing ineptitude and irresponsibility of the governments and their experts. They were unable to reach even the very modest agreements proposed. The climate collapse was often presented by them through euphemisms like global warming and climate change. They did not dare acknowledge the real magnitude of the current collapse, which openly treats the survival of the human species and is already destroying 200 species every day. To seriously acknowledge the fact that we cannot count on the governments could be a source of anxiety and despair if it were not for what we found in the streets of Glasgow, which offers an entirely different picture. Young people and women are taking into their hands the action, and they are leading new form of activism that constitute real change. They did not come to Glasgow to hear the official announcements or even to talk with the big and the powerful. They went to listen to each other, to learn together, to weave their struggles, and to give solid foundations to their hopes. One of the most impressive aspects of this very special mobilization is the horizon they adopted. Yes, they were trying to spoil the fig fiesta by showing how ridiculous and inappropriate were the official debates. But they did not fall into the trap of pretending to offer another great design to save the planet. There was a magnificent and humble recognition of human limits. They were acknowledging that we can only act at the human scale, necessarily local and situated, in reclaiming, regenerating, and creating anew their long displaced commons, their territories. They were cultivating common sense, the sense one has in community, which bind us to under mutual obligation and respects in the healing expressions of personal relationship. They described how they are trying to recover and regenerate their plural definitions of the good life. They hospitably celebrated their diversity and smiled at those trumpeting universal values or heralding environmental, technological, or economic catechisms in which uniformity and standardization are both premises and desirable outcomes of the human adventure. Their localization is not the inverse of globalization, a mere reaction to global forces. Their dignified initiatives water the roots of the traditions and celebrate their dreams, blessings, and autonomy. They are those enclosing the enclosers, building over the ruins left by colonizers and developers their own ways of living. In the new world, they are creating many worlds. Many worlds can be embraced, like the Zapatistas say. I am fully aware that in this conference, you will be reflecting on ways to advocate for national and global action for governments and corporations. As your president pertinently observed a year ago, and you quote in the call for the conference, however, we can no longer use the lens of the narrow, the disconnected, existing failed paradigms or tweaking on the edges of existing models. The activists in Glasgow demonstrated and illustrated that there is an increasing number of people around the world that don't want to use their time and energy to present demands to their governments. They can still organize resistance to other policies, to their policies and projects, and occasionally use some legal procedures for specific purposes, but they are basically concentrated in their own actions. Many people are currently abandoning the use of nouns supposedly expressing their needs, nutrition, education, health, because they create dependency from private and public systems which operate as traps, simultaneously catching and excluding. They recover their verbs associated with their own agency. Eating, learning, healing, settling allude to autonomous, organized activities defining ways of living rooted in tradition and clearly localized. The field of autonomous ways of eating had a kind of explosion during the pandemic. True, there was a similar explosion in food services delivered at home, but at the same time, many people started to cultivate and produce their own food. There was a peculiar scarcity of yeast in New York due to the number of families that started to produce their bread at home. Seeds disappeared from the shops in California because thousands of families bought them to start cultivating their own vegetables. What in the US is called community supported agriculture, and in Canada, community shared agriculture, which alludes to arrangements between urban consumers and rural producers that started in Japan and became very popular in Germany and other countries, registered everywhere an impressive expansion during the pandemic. Re-embedding food into agriculture keeps comida at the center of people's lives, transforming lunch and dinner into an opportunity to interact with family and friends, the opposite to fast food or eating at work. It is not an exaggeration to proclaim that the main battle for civilization today will take place in our stomach. Agribusiness will continue the criminal destruction of our habitat with their aggressive system of production, as well as our intoxication with the junk they sell as food, if people continue buying what they produce and sell. But the alternative is in our hands and advancing. Agribusiness owns or controls more than 60% of the food resources on Earth. But the small producers, mainly women, feed today 70% of the world's population. And urban agriculture is currently one of the most impressive achievements emerging everywhere. In the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, when hunger started in Cuba, people were forced to react and started to grow food everywhere. Today, Cuba is the world champion in organic agriculture and producing its cities more than 60% of what they consume there. At the same time, we must be extremely concerned with the fact that more than 45 million people are already in conditions of famine. It will be almost impossible for public and private humanitarian efforts to save all of them from dying or being severely affected for the rest of their lives. This clearly illustrates the current predicament. Famines, malnutrition, diabetes, and all kinds of pathological conditions affect the majority of people on Earth, given the dominant system and its irrational food regime. We cannot seriously expect that those running it, governments and corporations, will change their irresponsible path in search of profits. It is useless to beg them to do so, but we can stop them. Our autonomous capacity to produce our own food and our arrangements with campesinos and other small producers dismantle the system at its foundation, constructed with our consumption. We need to stop consuming the crap and poison they are selling us. That is the main point about food, about comida. That is why the main battle will be waged in the stomach. I have been involved with alternative education or alternatives to education for the last 60 years. Never before I had seen the wave of interest in alternative ways of learning emerging in the last year. After observing what was happening with the children plugged for hours into their computers and trapped within a curriculum entirely disconnected from their lives, many parents started to look for alternatives. Today, almost invisible, a social movement that does not look as such currently involves a great proportion of the population. The original motive of modern university, what created it 800 years ago, the idea of learning and studying with others, not everyone in his or her room, disappeared disappears in the current conditions of most universities, in which there is no contact between the students or between them and their teachers. More and more people of every age are now engaged in the search for ways of learning in which they reclaim what Illich suggested. To study should be the joyful activity of free people together. To stop consuming education, the commodity in which learning was transformed with capitalism, will have immense impact in our relations with nature. Healing from health is an expression born from the concerns associated with a health system increasingly counterproductive, as Ivan Illich demonstrated almost 50 years ago. For many years, an increasing number of people have been looking for alternative ways of healing, challenging the professional control of their ways of living and dying. In spite of the generalized fear created by the authorities everywhere with the new virus, many people began to offer personal or organized resistance. For many of them, the unprecedented confinement of people in good health was not acceptable as a human way of living. Beyond any dogmatic discussion about the nature of the threat the virus imposed, many people concentrated their attention and efforts in what was really important, their own immune system and the factors weakening it. very diverse initiatives started to proliferate. Many of them accepted the conclusion of the Lancet, the most prestigious medical journal in the world, which affirmed in 2019 that we were suffering a syndemic, not a pandemic. They commented recently that no matter how effective a treatment or protective a vaccine, the pursuit of a purely biomedical solution to COVID-19 will fail unless governments design policies and programs to reverse profound disparities. Our societies will never be truly COVID-19 secure. A syndemic approach provides a very different orientation to clinical medicine and public health by showing how an integrated approach to understanding and treating diseases can be far more successful than simply controlling epidemic disease or treating individual patients. Indigenous communities of Oaxaca don't read the Lancet or know the word syndemia, but they adopted the approach in dealing with COVID-19 with an impressive success. Rooted in tradition, they closed their communities to outsiders and resisted the instructions of the government. They concentrated their efforts in caring for the people at risk and strengthening the internal production of their food and the use of traditional remedies and ways of healing. Many communities in Oaxaca had no single case of infection, and those with a few cases have been fully recuperated from the disease. And this is only an example of what happened all around the world. In every sphere of daily life, we can find similar stories going on. One of their common threads is the emphasis in the notion of sufficiency, personal and communal, which is in open contradiction with all the prescriptions of development and capitalism. In many communities, you can still find people considered poor, very poor, underdeveloped, according to conventional standards, who affirm with a big smile, I have everything I need to be happy. This attitude resists naturally the compulsion to consume in which all of us have been educated. With the pandemic, for a series of complex reasons, the idea of sufficiency became contagious. More and more people started to adopt it. I cannot imagine anything more effective than this notion to deal with the climate and institutional collapse. Of course, most people are still affected by the compulsion to consume, but the current conditions of the world make it impossible for the majority to satisfy it. They are forced to buy only basic stuff to survive, often under miserable conditions. In this process, however, many people discover that it can also define an alternative, a satisfactory way of life, that many of the things that we're consuming are not necessary for a good life, and in fact may have adverse impacts in their personal and communal conditions. The spirit of sufficiency is thus beginning to circulate as an alternative path to the new era. This attitude is often adopted within a framework that radically contradicts the dominant perception of nature as a resource, something that can be used and exploited to satisfy needs or private gain. The notion of Mother Earth does not allude to a metaphor, but to the acknowledgement of our real nature. It defines an attitude of respect and responsibility towards other living and non-living beings and radically reject all anthropocentric attitudes. Nothing can better illustrate the argument I am sharing with you than the current trip of the Zapatistas in Europe, La Travesía. It is full of gestures, images, and behavior that may seem surreal and even ridiculous. The very fact that the first group, called 421, crossing the ocean in a small ship. The images of the Zapatista Air Force. The fact that the main speaker when they arrived to the continent was a non-binary person. The group was called 421 because they were 4 women, 2 men, and 1 non-binary person. Their peaceful invasion of Europe and later their simultaneous presence in 30 countries. Their interaction with hundreds of organizations and thousands of people in which they insist that they came just to listen and to learn, that they are not bringing any recipe to deal with the collapse. All the travestia looks like a very foolish invention. In my view, in the same way that the 1994 Zapatista uprising is generally recognized as the point of departure of the anti-systemic movements, the awakening before the neoliberal nightmare, we can consider La Travesía as the new awakening. In spite of all kinds of attacks, the Zapatistas have been able to construct in Chiapas a very satisfactory way of life based on autonomy, sufficiency, and freedom for hundreds of communities. They have been demonstrating that it is possible to courageously and successfully wage a struggle against patriarchy, capitalism, vanguardism, and statism. They negotiated with the government the San Andres Accords. After the government failed to fulfill them and observing the progressive deterioration and irresponsibility of the nation state and its structures, as well as the violence imposed as the mode of production was being transmogrified into a mode of dispossession, the Zapatistas adopted an autonomous path beyond the very notion of the state. They discovered long time ago what the activists in Glasgow are today affirming. Our only hope comes from the grassroots. La Travesía is an initiative to learn from the rebel Europe, the Europe that organized the reconstruction of the society from the bottom up. The Zapatistas learn with them and at the same time begin to weave a network of the autonomous groups that are currently transforming the resistance into liberation, a very radical form of social emancipation. Greta Thunberg insisted a month ago that she is not formulating an empty hope, but presenting a call for action. 50 years ago, Ivan Illich wrote that survival of the human race depends on the rediscovery of hope as a social force. Survival of the human race depends on the rediscovery of hope as a social force. Today, when we can clearly affirm that the climate collapse represents a very real threat to the survival of the human species, we have discovered that it is possible and absolutely needed to rediscover hope as a social force, to organize that hope. This is, in my view, what happened these days in Glasgow and what the Zapatista trip in Europe means. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. Thank you. I take great hope from your claim that there's that the idea of sufficiency has become increasingly contagious. So thank you. Can I start by just in responding to what you've said, to go back to one of your earlier points about the euphemism of climate change. So much of your work has been, attended to the necessity for new words, to think new thoughts. And we have, over the past number of years, there has been this proliferation of terms to speak about the mess we're in. So I noticed during your talk, you talk about the climate catastrophe, the climate collapse, the climate crisis, but also we've seen the growing circulation of words like the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene. So in light of your argument about the importance of language, like you've spoken about the significance of the shift from nouns to verbs, but in light of the emphasis that you place on the significance of language, what is the word that you think is most helpful for us thinking about this mess we're in at the moment?
It is, I think, one way of talking about this is to acknowledge that we are already living in a new era. Part of the problem is that the old era has not still left the picture, entirely the picture, and the new era is not clear. That does not have a new language. According with the historical experience, this is a moment for the artists. Apparently, the poets, the painters start to smell what comes and start to use those new words that means something, that anticipate what will represent the new era. But my basic reaction to what you ask is we need to start living and thinking and feeling the new era, rather to discuss the transition or the old era things. For example, about the questions of the climate, perhaps we don't need to abandon the word climate, but we need to know that instead of discussing how was the last year and how it's not raining, it's now with the temperature of May and we are in October, these kind of things, we need to know, we need to be fully aware. And I have seen campesinos experiencing exactly that kind of attitude. This is a new climate, and we know almost nothing about this climate. And we need to create, to explore the past only to learn something that can be useful for a new climate. It is not try to use all habits, all knowledge, all practices to apply as in the past. It is to find in the past something that can inspire us to do something about something radically new. This is about the climate. But this is exactly the same about all the rest in which the collapse is even worse. I think we have for all our lives thinking our countries as something real. We talk about Ireland and Mexico and every country is real. We were educated in the idea that we should be ready to even give our lives for that country, for that abstraction. The time has come to say that's an illusion. They are no longer there. We cannot live with abstractions. The abstractions are very useful because they throw light onto the reality. But we need to deal with the reality, not with the abstractions. And today, the nation states have still all the rituals, but they are no longer there. The main traits, what we attributed to this design, a specific design, the nation state, they cannot be real. All the functions of the nation states. For 200 years, the nation state, the main function of the nation state was the administration of the national economy. There are no national economies anymore. There is no country, no matter how big or how rich it is, that have a national economy. There are transnational forces defining the situation in every country. No nation states can be really real in spite of the bureaucrats and the passports and what is happening in the borders. The nation states are no longer there really. And when we talk about the governments, really, we need to really think that no one is in charge. This is the worst of all. It is not someone to blame. Oh, it is Bolsonaro. It was Trump. It is this guy, or it is this the mistake of these bureaucrats or this stupid policy of that party. No one is in charge. No one can really govern what is happening in any country. And then instead of trusting that illusion, we need to start living and feeling what we can do in the real world, in the world at the human scale, in where we can do something. Then the language will come naturally when we are talking about how to do something here now in this place. If we continue trying to discuss abstractions in which no one can do really anything, there is no any possibility for anyone to do anything at a global level. We need to acknowledge that. Then why to continue discussing that?
I noticed in the reports on the Zapatistas' visits to Ireland that they don't use the word countries, that they're using the term geographies, which I think is part of. So it's a use of language that does exactly what you're describing. Can I go back to your to blah blah blah, to Greta's criticism of the politicians and their blah blah blah? I watched a cartoon that she has released. Well, that it's a cartoon that she narrates, and in it is where she, like what you've said, that you cannot count on governments. It's very critical of political leaders. But one of the things in that she calls on politicians to do is to listen to the scientists. I just wonder what you think of that call from Greta.
My hope is that Greta will also learn how we can no longer trust the scientists. And the pandemic was a very good experience to have a fundamental distrust for the science. There is one single point that has been in our conversations very effective. Real good science, a good scientist, is a person that knows that through scientific experiments, analysis, etc., you can produce a very solid hypothesis about something that is a provisional hypothesis, because you will wait until a new analysis, a new experimentation will discover that it was not like that, but there is something different happening. Then if we really accept this fundamental principle about science, that any good scientist will accept that this is science, then we will abandon the very idea of scientific truth. I think that what Greta is saying is that science produced very good hypotheses about the climate collapse long time ago. And that was what she learned 10 years ago when she was 8 years old. They already knew everything about what was happening. She said at one moment, when you go to internet, etc., you can see the polar bears in the Arctic. That is not that's not the problem. We know what is happening. We know very well. We have had all the symptoms, all the expressions, and scientists have identified the causes of this, the problems of that determine these consequences, and the severity of the climate collapse. I think this is what Greta is saying, that we knew through scientific reports 10 years ago all that we need to know about what we need to do now to deal with this. And this is what the governments are not doing and will not do, because what we need to do is to change our way of life, and that means to abandon capitalism. There is no government that will say tomorrow morning, we will abandon capitalism as a kind of a system of production, and we will abandon consumption, and we will need to fight our, to radically change our way of life. No government can really do that. They are trapped with an, it's not only a mindset, it is trapped within a political system which they cannot speak the truth. They cannot say what is needed. That is the problem of the politicians today. It is impossible to be really truthful if you are occupying a position of power in any country in the world.
You referenced Ivan Illich as well, and of course one of his really powerful essays is on the idea of disabling professionals. And I know you in some of your work, you talk about professional dictatorships. And I wonder if in some ways we've seen an intensification of professional dictatorships during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in some ways, what you've described in Oaxaca is in some way, where you're talking about people who haven't necessarily read the Lancet, or but who are responding in their own ways, in very effective ways. But I'm just wondering, while those sorts of initiatives are certainly what you have described, like the idea of sufficiency becoming contagious, but also during the past period, we have seen an intensification of right-wing libertarian versions of autonomy. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how to respond to that.
Well, the point is very, very serious, and we are extremely concerned because it comes with a kind of, it's out of despair, fundamentalism of many, many people. It's not just a few leaders, fascist leaders or fascist ideas circulating around. It is millions of people that are desperate, and they fall into a kind of fundamentalism that is extremely dangerous. Last Tuesday in Dallas, Texas, there were 30,000 people waiting for hours for the arrival of Joseph Kennedy, the assassinated president of the United States, that he will come and transport in a gold chariot Mr. Trump to the White House. They were waiting for that for hours. Mm. Well, this is horrible. This is extremely dangerous. It was a condition of a kind of psychosis, a collective psychosis about something absolutely stupid and irrelevant. But it is the kind of behavior today exploited by some people to organize massive reactions. I don't know what will happen in the United States, because it is happening in many different ways in many parts of the United States. And there are millions of people mobilized around the very foolish things. And this is, of course, we all know that it is how fascist organizations, fascist regimes, fascist governments are created. This is a very, very clear danger that we have all over the world. It is desperate masses creating the possibility of a fascist government. And we need to react now, not when it is too late. Yes, the society of control is being implemented. Coming back to Illich, Illich was discussing all his anticipations, his fantastic anticipations. He saw this kind of crisis 50 years ago. He saw what will happen because he knew the basic trends. But in the 80s, he started to say, perhaps the era of tools is ending and we are entering into the age of systems. And then in the age of systems, when you try to use a tool, you are used by the tool and you became subsystem of a system. This is the danger today. This is what is happening with these millions of people. They're using a tool, a mobilization, whatever, and they are transformed into subsystems of a system that is blindly using them and using all of us. This looks absurd to connect, but there are some people in the United States, some very good activists, that decided to stop using their cellular, and that they are radically limiting the use of the computer. This is serious. I must say, I hate Zoom. I think it is creating a kind of slavery, a voluntary slavery. And we don't know how abusive is this technology. But of course, this technology allows us to see each other right now. I can see you, Orla, because we are using Zoom, because we are using this technology. Then it is not fundamentalism in the other direction. It's not to say, let's throw everything. No, it's not to throw everything. It is how to continue using the tools as tools, and instead of being used by the tools for something very dangerous. And to acknowledge that perhaps not the leaders, perhaps not Mr. Trump, but perhaps the people involved in these mobilizations, the people in the right, are people full of fear. And what we need in talking with them, in trying to present alternatives, is to deal with the fear. The main problem about COVID is they created the fear. And have the people on earth for the first time in history obeyed foolish instructions because they were full of fear. They are still with fear. They are still overwhelmed by the fear. What will happen with the virus? What will happen with the fifth variant of the virus? We will be with the virus forever. We will have COVID forever. How I can protect myself? A lot of fear with a very clear solution. When the communities of Oaxaca escaped from this, it was not because they did not have fear. They had a lot of fear, but instead of blindly obeying instructions, and instead of following a path that was for them a very dangerous path, perhaps I must say that I must talk here about local situations. The hospitals in Oaxaca were a disaster. And there was a moment in which they have 83% of lethality in hospitals with COVID. And then the people started to say they are killing the people in the hospitals. And they adopted the very sensible position of saying, no, we will not go to the hospital. And the very moment when they say, because of fear, we will not go to the hospital, you begin thinking, and then what I will do to react to the problem. It's not a denial. It's not saying the virus does not exist. The virus is there. It's an aggressive virus. What is the sensible thing to do before this virus? Instead of blindly following the instruction. And then they discover it in their own tradition, in their own knowledge, in traditional doctors, etc., an alternative path to deal with the problem. And then it is to acknowledge that the fear is there and that we need to deal with the fear, not to deny the fear, and not to deny the fact, not to deny the virus is there. We need to do something. But to abandon the idea, our main enemy in this moment is blind obedience. We are getting all kinds of instructions, some people, some governments, and some technology. The computers are instructing us to do something all the time. I can't remember all the time how I hate what the word tells me to do, but I don't want. I must accommodate myself when I'm writing to what word decides to do. I don't like that. I can't remember the time in which I can use my hand and my pen and do whatever I want with my hand and my pen. But this is the problem. This is what we need to do. How to deal technology, all the technologies, all the tools we are using, the governments, the corporations, everyone is instructing us to do something. It's increasingly foolish and damaging. If we go around and we go to the market to buy something, they are giving us instructions of what to buy or not to buy in the market. They are doing a lot of instructions about what to do. And then we are exposed to that. And we do that because we have been educated in that and because we have fear. This is what we need to discuss. This is what we need to challenge. To say to anyone, this is a discussion we had every week in Unitierra. Every day we can stop taking the decision to stop consuming something. Today, I will take the decision of no, I will no longer consume this specific thing, knowing that I really don't need it. How we can step by step, challenging all of our habits, our ways of thinking and acting, because they are no longer appropriate, because the situation changed, because we are in a new situation. That is why I'm saying that perhaps the most important point is to acknowledge that we are living in a new era, that we can no longer use what was appropriate in the past, just yesterday. We need to change almost everything. And here I will insist in one very specific point that I think it's also very important, and it is very legit. Friendship is the main path to reconstruct the society from the bottom up in the current discussion. Friendship becomes political, and it's the only space for a real political meaning, looking for the common good. The only politics that we can really practice is with friends. We all have 1,000 friends, but real friends, solid friends, good friends, we have only 3, 4, 5, 8 friends, if we are very rich in friends. With them, that also have 2 or 3 or 4 friends, with them, we can begin doing something meaningful. We can begin doing something about what we are eating, how we are healing, how we are doing learning, how we are doing everything. Not try to change the university, the institution, the government, the country. It is just to change with friends what you can change with a few friends. The kind of things that you can change with a few friends.
Okay. I'm thinking at this point, we should invite some others to contribute to get involved in this discussion. I haven't been following the chat, certainly listening to you. I think in terms of the world of Zoom, it is time for us to return to tools for conviviality. So let's see if there's, if we can see, if the tool of Zoom can enable some.
Orla, I know I will look at the questions, but I cannot see the question answers, but I can see in the chat, I had just put a question. So what is the role of national governments? And thank you, Gustavo. You have kind of really, I mean, it's very invigorating to listen to you as always. And I also see Suming has put in a comment. Maybe she can, maybe you could read that Orla also.
Okay, do you want me to read, or to Suming? Can Suming come in? Let's see, can I read the chat?
Please.
Okay, Suming.
Suming is joining us now.
Oh,
Oh,
great.
thanks for unmuting me.
Oh,
Yeah,
excellent.
hi. Yeah, so I've been listening, to the question, the really perspicacious question that you asked about science and skepticism towards science, and that maybe, yes, science has questions, but we it shouldn't be trusted really. And I've been thinking a lot about Gustavo's discussion here about, where does this right-wing fascistic popular mobilization come from? And it is linked to affect and the mobilization of political emotions, in this analysis, primarily fear. But I think there's a piece which is connecting the political emotions and the status of knowledge. Because it seems to me that the problem is not only fear, but it is a sort of nihilistic attitude towards knowledge, and how that nihilism, well, it starts with relativism, which is good because it admits the possibility for alternative knowledges. But then relativism can open the way, I think, also for a certain kind of, well, let's say nihilism, as in not accepting that there is any basis for truth. And that leads to cynicism, which is the idea that no knowledge can be trusted, therefore we should accept that all knowledge is a cynical tool. It's merely useful for the ends of power. There's no such thing as anything that is true in itself. And I think that there is this cynical affect, but which is related to the cynical attitude towards knowledge itself, which is really a problem for politics and the common good. I mean, the idea of a commons. We can't reclaim it if there is only cynicism, I guess.
Sorry, Sumin, can I add to that? And I've been having a look at populism recently to see what populism has been doing, excuse me, to the way in which our society has, in a way, warped recently. And what I'm looking at is cynicism with a level of inertia. I mean, people are cynical, but then they really don't care about things that are important. And it brings them out in a way through fear, possibly, but it brings them out to see John F. Kennedy, or it brings them out to events that are, in human terms, futile, a disregard for the climate, a disregard for humanity. And that sort of joint challenge that we have is about motivation, about delivering hope, about friendship indeed, because I think there's a big element of disengagement within society at the minute. And with that, I think there is a major problem at the core of society. Climate change, absolutely. Conflict, absolutely. We need to deal with those. As with COVID, we need to deal with COVID. But there is something happening, particularly in Western society, I have to say, that is disengaging, disempowering, and hopeless. And that's where our challenge starts from my reading of it. So, and thank you, Gustavo, for your presentation of a very engaging, hopeful sort of delivery for us. And I've taken loads of notes here. And after 30 years of teaching, I marvel at the fact that I'm still a student.
Should I react now?
Yes, please.
I am very happy with these very brilliant and solid reactions. This is actually the kind of conversation that we need to have all the time. And yes, we can clearly try to struggle against all kind of cynicism. This is not what we can accept as a consequences of this kind of discussion. I'm about challenging all kind of absolute truths of any nature. I have been using recently the association of three words that in my view represents the path to the new era. That is friendship, hope, and surprise. The three together in one single package. Through friendship, we can create, for example, the kind of truths that we can use for our behavior. We need some truths to do something, to do anything. We need to have some kind of confidence in something, in every day, for everything, for all the kind of things that we do. And then we need to construct and formulate the kind of things in we can really rely. One of the basic arguments that we are presenting now with trying to put within parentheses scientific truths. It is two kinds of different things. One is very strong recommendation that started with Plato more than 2,000 years ago. He said, abstraction is a very powerful human capacity, but to abstract is to take something out of reality and put it into the mind. We need, said Plato, we recommended Plato, we need to put that within parentheses to establish a very clear distinction between what we abstracted and the reality, because that, what we have in the mind, is not the reality. But apparently what happened in the West is that we lost the parentheses, and later we started to think, oh, the senses can cheat us. We can have optic illusions. But what we have in the mind is the real truth. There's the real reality. This is what is real. And we started to behave as if all the abstractions were real. That was our reality. And we started to produce truths about that reality. Then this is not only about science, it is about all the abstractions that we use every day. I mentioned one, that we all were raised with the idea that our countries were real, that Mexico was a reality. And then I need to do something for Mexico. I need to work for Mexico. I need to sacrifice my life for Mexico. And they constructed a series of rituals and ideas and history. If we can see any book of history about our countries, it's ridiculous how they invented the history, how they created this history of a country to format us, all of us, in a certain way, to control us, to dominate us. Then to have a fundamental distinction between what is real and what is an abstraction does not mean that I will not use abstractions. I will use abstractions all the time, but knowing that they are abstractions. They are not real. They are illuminating, they are throwing light into my reality. And in this way, in better, if I can do that with friends, we can construct hopes. Yes, it is fundamental. Spinoza said that the main two emotions of people are fear and hope. This is the emotion. Hope, it's important to see it's an emotion. Hope is not the truth. Hope is an emotion. I feel hope that this can happen. I feel hope that today will rain because I need that rain. I hope, and I see some signs that perhaps will rain. I nourish that hope, and we can nourish those hopes. But nourishing hopes, constructing hopes, as Illich said, recovering hope, constructing hope as a social force, constructing a common hope. Let's think that with friends, with a group of friends, with a group of neighbors, we construct a hope that we can have this outcome, we can have this kind of result of our action, and we start to do something with that hope. At the same time, we need to be open to surprise, because it is not true that we can predict everything, that we will know what will happen. We hope that this will happen, but we don't know what exactly will happen. And this is what we call it in the past wisdom. This is the wisdom of a peasants that know how to cultivate corn, that know what to do, but he is always open to surprise because he knows that he does not know. He's using all his knowledge, all his tradition, all what he was taught, he learned with his father perhaps how to cultivate corn, but he's open to surprise because no one really knows what will happen with anything. But to be open to surprise is not cynicism, fundamentalism, blindness. Is to be ready and to have plan B. I don't know if this will happen exactly as I hope. I know that. And then I need to have an alternative in case it does not rain. In case this not happen, then I will do this or I will do that. And this is, again, one form of formulating hope in a different way. It's not a blind hope, it's not a dogmatic hope, it is the only hope. We hope that this will happen and this is the only thing that we will expect. No, that is expectation. That is something different. That is not hope. Then we need to nourish a different kind of hope. Yes, I am fully aware that I am walking on the edge, that it is a dangerous path. Yes, that we can fall into the abysses of cynicism, of nihilism, of these kind of things. This is dangerous to do these kind of things. It is better, it is more comfortable. Oh, I believe in science and science tell me that, and then that is right. COVID is a good example. You can have science for anything about COVID. There are a group of scientists that have a very solid experiment or analysis or tests telling you anything that you want about COVID. How to do, what to do, if the masks are useful or not. Just in England, they produced a study that is a terrible study comparing people that are fanatics of the use of the mask and those that are challenging the mask and refuse to use the mask. And then they compare the two groups, those using all the time the mask for every purpose and those refusing to use the mask all the time. And they compared, and the figures were identical in terms of infection, of diseases, of deaths, etc. That's terrible. They are suddenly saying the mask is useless. It's not produce any good result. Well, you can use those studies. You can use science for any purpose. Any truth that you want about COVID, you can have a scientific studies telling you how it started, how aggressive is the virus, what is the treatment, what is to do, that is what we need to know. Then to blindly trust one scientific truth is foolish. That is what I am trying to say.
What I welcome in the discussion with you, Gustavo, is how you force us to think beyond the kind of binary that I think in COVID, particularly around, say, public health guide, it's either you're a COVID denier or or compliant, but actually that that there are more possibilities beyond that. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you for walking on the edge. Are there Other questions there?
I just wanted to say something because I read, pluriverses. So when you said there is no one scientific truth, it kind of leads us to that whole discussion around pluriverses. Would you like to say something on that, Gustavo?
And this is not something entirely new, but in the last 20, 30 years, there is a very, very solid tradition now created, challenging all forms of universal definitions of anything. Challenge any universal definition of the word. I can remember that almost 30 years ago, I was in a conversation with Ivan Illich, and we were discussing this. Illich started to become the Illich we know because an intercultural experience. He came with a universal mentality. He came to New York to study in Princeton with this universal mentality. Catholic means universal. That it was the mind of Illich. And then when he crossed the barrio, the neighborhood in New York with the Puerto Ricans, he saw another universe, another kind of culture. He was horrified by the treatment that these jibaritos were getting from the Irish priests in that specific neighborhood, and he became pluricultural, opened to the pluriverse. And then we were discussing with Ivan these kind of things. And then there was a very magnificent, great mathematicians, Liscano, Spanish mathematicians, and he said, okay, guys, but let me tell you that 2 + 2 are 4 everywhere. And that is absolutely universal. And then after the conversation, Ivan it was possible to convince Liscano to go to China and to learn Chinese mathematics. And after a few years, Liscano produced a book. The title of the book is The Mathematics of the European Tribe. And he presented the argument that the mathematics that he assumed that were universal, that was the standard truth about mathematics all over the world, were just the mathematics of the European tribe. That even in that field, mathematics, you can have the pluriverse. We are finally recognizing that we are living in a pluriverse and that we can adopt a universal position about anything for the whole planet or for the whole species or for the universe or for anything that we think rooted in a culture, and every culture has different ways of perceiving the world or dealing with the world and doing everything. Yes, I think that there is a very solid tradition now about the pluriverse that is challenging all kind of universal definitions of the world or of ourselves. And this can come to an extreme and that can be very beautiful, very fruitful. When we acknowledge the radical otherness of the other, we have immediately the question of how we will communicate with the other. If we know that he or she has a different kind of mind, a different rationality, that there is no reason, we cannot have a common reason to examine anything, then how we will relate with him or her? And that is a fascinating discussion, fascinating. Today, it's one of the most important fields that we need to discuss, how to deal with the multiple cultures that we are. This is here one phrase of the Zapatistas. We need to listen. But Comandante Tacho once said, to listen, it's not just to hear the other, but to be ready to be transformed by the other. This is really to listen. They are coming to Europe now. They are saying all the time, they are coming to listen, but listening with this meaning. Listening to you is meaning that I am open to be transformed by you. But what you are telling me, even if I know that you belong to a different universe, that you are not in my universe, that you are really different. And this can be applied in political terms to the trip of the Zapatistas, or in a couple, to know that your loved one is really different, is another. For this conversation, I am often using a very stupid story. There is the couple, they love each other very much, and suddenly he says, Chonita, I don't understand why you want to go to the birthday of your aunt to celebrate with her birthday. You know what will happen. The guy will become drunk. He will fight with everyone. We will be expelled from the house, and we will need months and months to reclaim the friendship with your aunt. This happens every year. Why you want to go again to that fiesta of your aunt? And after a few moments of silence, he said, okay, let's go, because I love you. Meaning he does not understand in her rationality, it's stupid to go to that party. They know what will happen. It has been always a disaster. But he loves her. And if she wants, for whatever peculiar reason, okay, he will go. This is a very stupid example of what we need to do today. We cannot understand the others in many occasions. We cannot understand people that are close to us. We need to recognize the otherness of the others. But heart to heart, perhaps we can start something. We can reach an agreement. In Spanish, the acuerdo comes from cor cordis, the heart. It's a relation between hearts, not between minds.
Thank you for that.
Okay, I think we've probably exceeded the time that was allocated to this. A country might be an abstraction, but as you've mentioned, Gustavo, a stomach isn't, and it might be time for time to attend to our bellies. But thank you so much for this extremely nourishing exchange. Thank you.
Very good to be with you, Orla. Hopefully we will continue the conversation in this stupid way, in other ways.
Yes.
We can have many ways to relate to each other. Great.
Gustavo, thank you, Orla. I just want Dr. Jared McCann to say the final words, and there's Michelle is there. Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Orla. Thank you, Michelle, for opening the conference for us. If I can just indulge and just pick out a few, I've been taking notes, just to pick out a few direct quotes from Gustavo, which may lead us into the conference, I think, quite ably. We need agreement on action. What is needed is to act at the local level. Climate struggle should be combined with social struggle. Change will come from below, not from the top. We are saying, yes, we can do something. Give solid foundation to hopes, celebrate dreams. And finally, we need the rediscovery of hope as a social force. So hopefully, as I say, I indulged there in terms of selecting what I saw as innovative and inspiring sort of sentences from your own presentation there. So thank you for that. That was excellent. We have a long 2 days ahead of us. There will be a lot of discussion. Our focus will, by and large, be around development within the context of the ongoing debates around climate change. We have excellent speakers. We have some very challenging discussions to be had around this. And I think that in terms of what we've put together for the next 2 days is not only sort of matching the aspirations of the SAI and indeed the development sector and those working in the field and those in academia working around this, but I think also we're looking towards possibly trying to match some of the energy that is coming out of the social movement that we can see in Glasgow at the minute. And that, I think, could be a motivating factor for us over the next couple of days. I think we need to sort of look beyond what is the sort of the smog of government and governance and try to elaborate on what we see at the minute, particularly with young people, trying to articulate and develop a new vision of what development is, and indeed engaging with the issues that we are working with within the development sector. So you have the program, you have the rollout over the next couple of days. We start tomorrow with Nita again, and thank you to Nita, at 10 a.m. So I think unless, Nita, you have any other points to make, I think we could close it at this point and start early enough tomorrow morning back into this conversation. So thank you again, Gustavo, Orla, Michelle, Nita, Hugh in the background there, and also Sue Ming for contributing, and other members of the team working on this, including Kira and Jean. So thank you very much, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you again.
Okay.
Thanks all. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.